Michael Popok, Legal AF. When you compare the indictment last Tuesday by Jack Smith against Donald Trump for 4 criminal counts and 3 conspiracies, and you compare it, for instance, to the Jan 6 report and the evidence that was developed meticulously, painstakingly by that committee, including hundreds of witness testimony and evidence, emails, text messages, and the like, you come away from the conclusion, when you compare and contrast those two things, that something's missing. Something's missing in the indictment, not by accident. I've already said on a hot take and on Legal AF, the podcast that I co-anchor, that this was a surgical strike by Jack Smith, that every I was dotted, every T crossed, every sentence went through a wordsmithing workshop to pick out exactly what needed to be in there and what didn't. And things ended up on the cutting room floor, to talk about old Hollywood references to cutting and editing a film. And things ended up on the cutting room floor on purpose. But the thing that is missing, like a stew that's missing an ingredient, is Mark Meadows. We know there are 6 co-conspirators because they're listed by number, at least for now, and we already know who they are, right? John Eastman, Sidney Powell, Rudy Giuliani. Come on, you can do it with me. It's beginning to be like a nursery rhyme. Ken Cheeseborough and Boris Epstein are all 1 through 6. We got that. Where's Mark Meadows? And why am I harping on Mark Meadows? Because if he is cooperating with Jack Smith and they purposely didn't want to signal how much he's cooperating by tipping off Donald Trump and his defense team, by putting in specific quotes from him, but know that implicitly, sort of reading between the lines, that on many or most of the conspiracy elements and the steps of the conspiracy, the use of the fake electors, the use of the big lie about the fraud as a pressure campaign on state elected officials and election officials, the pressure campaign on Mike Pence, that use of the fake electors and what their purpose was, Mark Meadows can testify about each and every one of those things. In fact, the takeaway, because he didn't testify before the Jan 6 committee, even though Mark Meadows was pressured, had the executive privilege stripped away from him, and he was forced to testify before the grand jury for Jack Smith, something the Jan 6 committee never got their hands on, and has likely cut a deal and is cooperating. But where is he in the fiber of the being of the indictment? Because he's all over the Jan 6 report. Let me give you examples, right? You want to put on a case about the voter fraud being false and Donald Trump knowing it from outside consultants he hired, reporting it to him, lawyers that he paid for, telling him, in-house lawyers, outside lawyers, inside staff and aides, outside staff and aides. You want to tell that story? You can tell it through Mark Meadows. You want to talk about how the House Freedom Caucus, including Scott Perry, representative from Pennsylvania, was involved with the pressure campaign and a consideration to implement martial law, suspend the Constitution, and seize voting machines? Mark Meadows can be your guy, your witness to tell that story. You want to talk about the fake electors. You want to put on evidence of the fake electors scheme, how it came to be, how it germinated, where it came from. Peter Navarro, John Eastman, Ken Cheeseborough, putting it together, how they implemented it, the math behind it, the logical thinking, and logical thinking is doing a lot of heavy lift in that sentence, behind it, the constitutional underpinnings of it, and there were none. You want to have that in front of a jury? You have Mark Meadows who can tell that story. You want to talk about how Donald Trump tried to weaponize the Department of Justice and use and jump over, like some child's game of leapfrog, 2 or 3 more senior people acting as the Attorney General and the Deputy Attorney General to get the guy that he wanted that would do his bidding, and Jeff Clark? That's Mark Meadows. Mark Meadows introduced Donald Trump to Jeff Clark, who was number 4 at best on the Department of Justice totem pole. Mark Meadows. You want to talk about how Donald Trump and others around him and his aides used the riot, the insurrection on Jan 6th, as their fulcrum point, as the tip of their spear to continue to try to stop the certification when all else failed, all the 80 lawsuits and all of the attacks on the elected officials and election officials and the pressure campaign on Mike Pence when all else failed, and they got behind the riot to try to steal the election. Mark Meadows can talk and testify about that. The pressure campaign on each of the states. Mark Meadows participated in the phone calls to Brad Raffensperger, Secretary of State of Georgia, and others. Mark Meadows went to Georgia to try to impact and influence state legislators to throw the election to Donald Trump. Mark Meadows. You want to talk about Team Crazy and who put together Team Crazy? Rudy Giuliani, Sidney Powell, Pat Byrne from Overstock, or what I call Overthrow.com founder, Michael Flynn, Jenna Ellis. That all ran through the chief of staff, Mark Meadows. Mark Meadows can testify about the assembly of Team Crazy and how it operated and the lawsuits related to it. And you want to have somebody testify about this crazy, wacko, unhinged meeting on the 18th of December in the Oval Office that was unplanned, and Rudy Giuliani, Sidney Powell, Mike Flynn, and Pat Byrne from Overstock.com just burst in to the Oval Office, and for the next 8 or 9 hours try to convince the president of the United States at the time to declare martial law, suspend the Constitution, and seize voting machines. Mark Meadows can testify about that because he phoned into that meeting and he sided, thank God, with Pat Cipollone, the White House counsel for Donald Trump, in telling Donald Trump, you can't do that. But if you want to put on that evidence, it's Mark Meadows. So there's a couple of ways to interpret where's Waldo? Where's Mark Meadows? Why is he not more prominently featured in the indictment the way he was prominently featured throughout many chapters of the Jan 6 report and the 8 or 9 steps of the conspiracy, the coup in search of a legal theory, to paraphrase Jamie Raskin? Why not? Well, I'm going to take it from a practicing trial lawyer's perspective. It's not because he's not cooperating. This would be my working theory, my thought experiment. It's because Mark Meadows is able to testify convincingly under oath about all of those elements, those chains, those badges of conspiracy. But he doesn't have to be listed in the indictment, because indictments are not supposed to accumulate and summarize all the evidence the government has against the person. It merely has to be legally sufficient to put the person on notice of the charges against them, the elements of the charges against them, and the bare minimum of facts developed by the grand jury to indict. But there's layers and layers and layers of other witness testimony and evidence that will come out at trial. Trials are not just, let me put it this way, trials aren't about some prosecutor for the Department of Justice reading aloud the indictment, and they're stuck with whatever the indictment says as the evidence they can put on. No, that's not how our system of justice works. The indictment has an independent purpose and role in our justice system, but it's limited. It is the charging document, right? And from there, then it is up to the prosecutor to meet their burden of proof, which is beyond a reasonable doubt, to prove all the elements of each crime. Starting with, because every crime has to have one element in common. There has to be proof of willful intent, knowing willful intent, criminal mind. It's called mens rea in the law. And Mark Meadows can help with all of the mens rea about the big lie for all the factors that I just listed. And the fact that he's missing from the indictment, to me, does not mean he's missing from Jack Smith's toolbox or his prosecution body of evidence that he's going to array against Donald Trump. It's just that Jack Smith, the master genius, the master strategist, doesn't want to tip Donald Trump off or his lawyers off more than they need to. That is another advantage Even though we talk incessantly about the requirement that the government, under due process, turn over all of the evidence that they have, including all of the witness transcripts that they have, which would include Mark Meadows. And if somebody's cooperating, they have to inform the defendant that somebody is cooperating with the government and against them. Right? So that's not so they're not sandbagged or surprised at trial. But that doesn't mean that they have to tell them chapter and verse exactly how they're going to use a witness, in what order, in what sequence, and for what point. They'll read the transcript from Mark Meadows to the extent that there is one. If there are notes about meetings and interviews with Mark Meadows, that gets turned over as well. But the little color, the nuance, the things that are at the fingertips of the prosecution about a witness, about how they think he's going to perform at trial, that's up here. And that doesn't have to be provided to the defense. And it doesn't have to certainly be provided to the defense this early in the game. I think that's more likely what I just described, that Mark Meadows is cooperating and able to, at a moment's notice, in a shape-shifting way, be a lead witness for any of those things I just talked about, from the fake voter fraud theory that Donald Trump has been clinging to against the weight of all the other evidence and information he was given, the fake elector scheme itself, the use of the House and people like Scott Perry against our democracy, the use of the Department of Justice and Jeff Clark in particular as a weapon to stop the peaceful transfer of power, the use of the Jan 6th riot to hide behind and also use as a weapon to stop the peaceful transfer of power, the pressure campaign on Mike Pence, the pressure campaign on the states, the use of the lawsuits as a weapon, the use of Team Crazy and the recruitment of all those crazy crackpot lawyers to represent Donald Trump on purpose to let him try to cling to power and stop the peaceful transfer. All those roads lead back to one person. If you only had one person, Jack Smith, that you could put on at a trial, if for some reason our justice system said, government, you get one person, who would it be? It would be Mark Meadows. So the fact that he's missing from the indictment, so to speak, and people are commenting on that, I would not take that to mean that Mark Meadows is not cooperating, because if he wasn't cooperating, he would be indicted, or he'd be listed at least as number 7, as a 7th co-conspirator, and he is not. The fact that he's not in the indictment in that way, right, supports my thought experiment. And it shouldn't, however, the takeaway from the hot take here shouldn't be Mark Meadows has gone rogue and Jack Smith doesn't trust him and therefore didn't want to rely on him. I think it's the opposite. I think Jack Smith, carefully crafting his indictment, didn't want to disclose more than he has to in submitting the Brady or discovery material to the other side at the right time. And Mark Meadows, he knows, Jack Smith knows, Mark Meadows knows, and Donald Trump and his lawyers should know, is able to just dump on and kill Donald Trump on all of those topics that I just listed. And we know that because other people standing side by side with Mark Meadows, like his assistant, Cassidy Hutchinson, have testified to the Jan 6 committee and or to the grand jury, right? Jason Miller, aides, all of the lawyers that were around Mark Meadows that were legitimate, like Pat Cipollone and Pat Philbin and Greg Jacobs and Eric Hirschman, and from the Department of Justice, like Jeff Rosen and Richard Donahue, they'll all testify about what Mark Meadows knew or shouldn't have known, right? And what he can testify to. That's what I think we're going to see. I'm bringing it to you here on this hot take. I only do this in one place, and that's on the MeidasTouch YouTube channel. You can find all of my body of work there. Go free subscribe, MeidasTouch YouTube channel. Get them to 2 million subscribers before this year is over. They're so close. If you want to go hang out and see everything related to law and politics and the intersection of law and politics, go to the new MeidasTouch.com website. And you can also find and watch hot takes and podcasts like Legal AF. You like these hot takes? Every Wednesday and Saturday, we pull it all together in one long format audio and video version of a podcast called Legal AF, right? It's like 6 hot takes in a row, but I'm joined on Wednesdays by Karen Friedman-Agnifilo and on Saturdays with Ben Mycelis. And you can follow me, Michael Popok, on all things social media, including now Threads, at MS Popok. Until the next hot take, Michael Popok, Legal AF reporting.
Hey, Meidas Mighty. Love this report? Continue the conversation by following us on Instagram, at MeidasTouch, to keep up with the most important news of the day. What are you waiting for? Follow us now.